In just 5 minutes, a powerful judge tried to silence Jasmine Crockett with a $20,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, just an abuse of power. But what he didn't expect was that this moment would push him to the brink of his own downfall. What was supposed to be a routine hearing exploded into a breathless battle between arrogance and justice. Can one black woman, with only the right and the courage, bring an entire system to its knees? Stay with us. It's a story worth every second of your attention. On a cold, gray morning in downtown Miami, Courtroom 1B was scheduled for a minor hearing. Just a quick review of the records, but the moment Jasmine walked in, she knew something was wrong. Jasmine, a veteran attorney and former prosecutor, had seen enough to sense when a room was tampered with. The silence was too deep. The courtroom staff avoided eye contact. Even the walls seemed to be listening. Judge David Hargrove was already seated, tall, stern, and known for handing down rulings without full reasoning. He didn't read the files. He delivered sentences. His cold gaze followed Jasmine as she entered. He didn't look at her as a lawyer. He saw her as an obstacle. The courtroom felt like a trap, and Jasmine walked right into it. Everyone could feel it. The air wasn't just tense, it was controlled. The judge wasn't here for justice. He was here for power. Hargrove strode with a presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. He didn't pause. He didn't greet the court. He didn't glance at the bar. He simply sat down, adjusted his robe with a sharp tug, and then stared stiffly ahead, eyes cold and flat. His voice followed next, deep, short, and without hesitation. This matter is already settled. The defendant violates Section 19H. The penalty is $20,000, payable immediately. This is the court's decision. No preamble, no explanation, no process, just a blunt declaration, as if the case had already been heard and buried long before the doors opened. Jasmine hadn't spoken a word. Her files were still closed on the table. Her hands, which had just rested calmly on them, were now slightly curled, controlled but tense. In the room, even the district attorney looked up in confusion. His brow furrowed, he shifted in his chair as if he'd missed something crucial. But in fact, no one had missed anything. There were no arguments, no evidence, not even the usual procedural opening. Just a verdict, final, cold, irrevocable. It was a legal barrage, and Jasmine was expected to nod, accept it, and walk away wounded. But she didn't. At first, she tried to understand. "Your Honor," she said carefully, only half rising from her chair. "With all due respect, we haven't even begun. I haven't presented a single argument." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, not in deliberation, but in irritation. "Because there's no need," he snapped. "You violated the rule. That's not up for debate." The tone wasn't just dismissive. It was caustic, deliberate, designed to demean. This wasn't a misunderstanding of the law. It was a calculated message. Sit down. Be quiet. Don't challenge this court. Jasmine didn't react the way most people would in that moment. No raised voice, no visible frustration. She remained standing, her hands calmly clasped in front of her, every movement precise and controlled. Her heart might be pounding beneath her tailored blazer, but outwardly she was unyielding. This control was not just instinct, but also training. Years as a prosecutor had taught her that in a courtroom where power is abused, restraint is the sharpest weapon. She took a deep breath and then spoke with clarity and purpose. "Your Honor, with full respect, I respectfully request the opportunity to present my defense. Due process requires that I be heard." Her voice broke the silence, not loud, but unmistakably firm. Her words carried not only legal authority but moral weight as well. She didn't ask, she was invoking a right. But Hargrove didn't even flinch. He didn't even pretend to consider her request. He was looking at her right now, but not fairly. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tensed, as if her very words had offended him. He leaned forward, both elbows on the bench, and said, louder this time, "Ms. Crockett, this is not your stage. This is my courtroom, and I will not entertain speeches or delaying tactics." The words ripped through the room like a whip. "The violation is recorded. The punishment is final. Do you want to argue? Then take it to appeal. If it ever comes to that." His tone was sharp, final, and dripping with contempt. Not legal skepticism, but personal contempt. The way he turned sentences into punishments was a warning to everyone watching. The courtroom had become a stage for intimidation. And Jasmine was the target. She didn't move. She stood like a statue under pressure. But in her head, everything was happening faster. Fast, focused. This wasn't a legal process. It was an exercise of control. Hargrove didn't abide by the law. He used the bench as a throne. His voice, his posture, and his refusal to even let her speak all pointed to a truth. He'd already made up his mind, and nothing she said would change that. But it wasn't just about her case. It was about silencing her in front of everyone else, setting an example and reminding every lawyer, every clerk, every citizen watching from the gallery. "If you challenge me, I will openly destroy you without hesitation." Jasmine could feel it. It wasn't just about breaking the rule anymore. It was about her presence, her confidence, her refusal to submit. Hargrove wasn't responding to the law. He was responding to her power, her voice. And now he was trying to take it away from her with one judgment after another. The prosecutor avoided eye contact. The clerk had stopped. The room was no longer neutral. It had become hostile. And yet, in that silence, Jasmine found clarity. Hargrove had made one thing abundantly clear. He never intended to give her a fair hearing. He hadn't come to listen. He had come to dominate. Yet she didn't sit down. She didn't give up. Her voice was quieter now, but stronger. "Then I suppose we proceed in the record. Every word, every step, because if the law doesn't protect me today, the truth will. And every injustice needs a witness." And in that moment, Jasmine made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but with something far more dangerous for a man like Judge Hargrove. Clarity. She had seen enough to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a rush. This was surgical suppression. She wasn't being punished for a violation of the rules. She was being silenced for being who she was, for the strength in her voice and the refusal in her stance. Everything in Hargrove's courtroom was arranged to convey a message. "You don't belong here. You may know the law, but I own the bank." He had the gavel, but Jasmine had something heavier, precedent. And as she dug into her papers, the shift in the room was almost audible. The silence was no longer one of respect. It was anticipation, the kind of silence that prevails before the first domino falls. She spread the documents out before her like parts of a machine only she knew how to operate. Each page was carefully selected, marked, and rehearsed for this very moment. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm and sharp. "We're going to talk about precedent, because what you're doing has already been tested and hasn't held up." She lifted the first page. Case Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. The defendant was convicted under a local enforcement code. No photos, no inspection reports, no affidavit, just the officer's word. She let the page rest for a moment, then continued. In its written opinion, the Superior Court stated, "Where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement." The integrity of due process demands more than assumptions. Her tone didn't change. She wasn't trying to deliver a performance. She was building pressure, line by line, statute by statute. She turned to the second page. Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. An officer imposed a penalty based on a visual assessment. No photos, no timestamps, no physical evidence. The city argued that was standard practice. The court disagreed. In its decision, it stated, "Administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Penalties must be based on verifiable facts or they are invalid under constitutional review." She looked at Hargrove slowly, trying to get clarity. This decision was supported at every level. And that was the first time Hargrove changed his expression. It was small, a tight set of the jaw, a slight shift of the shoulders, but Jasmine noticed. So did the others. The typist released the keys almost with urgency. The prosecutor spread his legs and leaned forward, hands clasped, suddenly more spectator than participant. Jasmine also stepped closer, rhetorically speaking. "You're imposing a $20,000 fine on me," she said, without asking for evidence, without allowing arguments, without even opening the hearing. Her voice grew sharper, not louder, but more determined. "There's no documentation, no witness testimony, just your word. And by the way, that's not justice. That's authoritarianism in judicial robes." A subtle wave of unease rippled through the gallery. Lawyers in the back row exchanged quick glances, as if silently wondering, is she really saying that? She did, and she wasn't finished. Jasmine tapped her file once more. "I bring these cases not as theory, but as binding reminders of what this courtroom should stand for. When a judge ignores the procedures, silences the defense, and rules without evidence, they aren't interpreting the law. They're breaking it, and I won't allow that to happen quietly." She stood still, her eyes fixed on Hargrove, her voice almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like thunder. "You can ignore my argument, but you can't erase precedent, and you won't rewrite the Constitution from behind this bench." Judge Hargrove didn't blink at first, but Jasmine noticed the change. His jaw tensed. His sharp focus was lost for half a moment as his gaze flicked briefly to the clerk, then to the prosecutor's bench. His fingers, previously steady on the bench, began tapping a slow, irregular rhythm. He was calculating hard. Every decision he'd made up to this point had been based on control, intimidation, and the assumption that Jasmine would retreat or crack under pressure. But now the foundation on which he stood had begun to crumble. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She'd done so with surgical precision, ruling that Judge Hargrove couldn't in the slightest deny their previous relationships. And that frightened him more than any anger ever could. His voice, when she finally returned to him, was cold and forced. "This court will adjourn for 15 minutes, he declared abruptly, standing up. No explanation, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. It was an escape disguised as procedure. A retreat hidden behind the facade of norms and protocols. The bailiff moved quickly, opening the room for Hargrove as he disappeared with his robe trailing behind him like a shield. He wasn't even sure what he could carry anymore. But Jasmine knew exactly what had just happened. This wasn't a pause to examine evidence. This was a tactical retreat, a pause to strategize, to gather support, to find something he could use to discredit her, to push her out of her collateral, or to delay the inevitable. Because now he wasn't just facing a lawyer. He was facing responsibility. The courtroom remained silent in that moment, as if unsure whether to breathe again. The clerk looked nervously, her eyes darting toward Jasmine without meeting her directly. The prosecutor remained silent, but his fingers fidgeted restlessly in his lap. Jasmine, however, didn't move. She stood still, back straight, her hands gently resting on the stack of precedents she'd unpacked like a living weapon. She wasn't seeking applause. She was reading the room. And what she saw was exactly what Hargrove feared: doubt. Doubt creeping into the cracks in his authority. Doubt slid over every silent observer who had just witnessed what few ever say aloud in a courtroom. That even a judge could be wrong. That even a judge could be cornered. 15 minutes. That was all he asked. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't a moment to think. It was a moment to save himself. He would try to change his strategy, shift the narrative, maybe even call in reinforcements. Because the only thing more dangerous than a well-prepared lawyer was one who was fearless, grounded in the truth, and unwilling to give in under pressure. Jasmine had stepped over a line most never dared to cross. She wasn't just demanding justice. She was forcing the court to confront its own inequality. And Hargrove, in all his years on the bench, had no playbook for that. As the minutes ticked down and the room fell into a fragile, uncertain silence, Jasmine remained steadfast, poised, focused, and unyielding. The judge had left to seek higher ground, but she would not leave. Not until every inch of this courtroom remembered what it meant to stand for justice. When the door to the judge's chambers finally opened, All eyes drew closer and narrowed in confusion. Judge Hargrove re-entered, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a second figure, taller, older, with an air of institutional gravity. Judge Thomas Whitaker. His black robe seemed heavier than Hargrove's, the fabric moving with a kind of deliberate weight that can only come from decades of experience in federal court. The room changed instantly. It wasn't just about another body in the courtroom. It was about what its presence meant. A low murmur ran through the gallery, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort. Even the court officer stood straighter and more at attention, as if suddenly realizing that this case had gone from routine to something far more explosive. Jasmine knew immediately what that meant. You don't call Judge Whitaker for a hearing like this unless something is going off the rails. And Hargrove, despite his haughtiness, felt the string tighten. Hargrove returned to the bench, his voice no longer the dominant quality he had displayed before. For the record, he explained, clearing his throat, I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe and, if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural issues that have arisen. It was a carefully worded statement meant to seem like a provincial, even-handed routine, but everyone in the room could hear the underlying truth. He was losing control, and now he needed someone with more authority to steady the ship before it capsized. Hargrove didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't, not after the precision with which she had dissected his earlier decision. Instead, he leaned back, almost disappearing into his chair, as Whitaker's presence filled the space he could no longer command. Jasmine stood still, but her senses were on high alert. She had read about Whitaker, a former appeals court judge, now a senior federal supervisor, known for his intelligence, ruthlessness, and strict adherence to the court's rules. He wasn't the kind of person who had to shout. A single look from him was often more effective than 100 objections. And now that look fell on Jasmine, not with hostility, but with sharp clarity. He was assessing her, not just her words, but also her posture, her breathing, and the rhythm of her silence. And Jasmine knew what that meant. She wasn't just defending herself against a biased judgment. She was facing the court and a system. She didn't tremble. She held his gaze a second longer than necessary. Her chin lifted, her presence anchored. She wasn't intimidated, but aware of it. This wasn't just a court. It was a battleground between legacy and reform, between entitlement and earned credibility. Hargrove had brought Whitaker in, hoping to tip the scales, to overpower her voice through hierarchy. But Jasmine had something no robe could override. Precedents, constitutional foundations, and undeniable evidence that she was right. This wasn't just a legal defense. It was a challenge to the hierarchy that Hargrove had allowed to operate unsupervised for years. Whitaker adjusted his robe, glanced at the case file on the bench, and finally spoke. His voice was even, deliberate, but undeniably authoritative. Miss Crockett, he said, you have raised several constitutional concerns regarding the enforcement of Section 19H. I would like you to restate your central argument for the record. It wasn't a request. It was a test, a living trial, and Jasmine understood. She had entered a rigged courtroom, exposed the trap, and now had to defend her truth under the watchful eye of the federal government. One false step, and everything could collapse. But one precise word, and she would not only survive this space, but own it. So, without looking down, without hesitation, she answered, yes, Your Honor. I will begin with the failures of due process, supported by precedent. Her voice not only retorted, she declared, the rules have changed. Power has shifted, and Hargrove knew it. Whitaker was here to weigh the law. But the courtroom already lusted after Jasmine. The courtroom was plunged into a cold, humming silence. Jasmine stood at the defense table, her hand lightly on the leather edge of her file. She didn't move as the bailiff called, Officer Nathan Ellis, please. From behind, a man rose with the stiff posture of one who believes he has nothing to prove. His dark blue uniform shone spotlessly, and his badge gleamed as if it had been polished for this moment. He strode with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in 2 decades. That was about to change. Jasmine watched him prance, like a surgeon working with a firm hand on injured tissue. Ellis didn't even look at her. He stared ahead, like a man initialing a form he'd already filled out 100 times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and recited the oath. Then he sat down, clasped his hands together, and waited. As if he already knew how this would end. Jasmine took 3 slow steps toward the witness stand. Not hasty, not dramatic, just enough to make him and everyone else in the room feel the weight of what was about to happen. "Officer Ellis," she began, her voice calm, not challenging. "You issued the citation that led to the fine against me, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered easily, almost too casually. "That citation was based on a violation you claimed to have witnessed." "That's right," she nodded slightly. "Let's break this down. Did you document the alleged violation with photographs?" "No, ma'am," he said, shaking his head. "That wasn't necessary." Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. "Did you write a detailed incident report?" "No. No plan, no affidavit, no time-stamped images from a city camera." "That wasn't necessary," Ellis replied with a small shrug. "Was anyone else present at the time of the alleged violation?" "No one was." Jasmine paused for a full moment, turning slightly to the gallery and the bench. Her words were slow and deliberate. "To be clear, you were chasing a $20,000 fine based on your personal assessments without photographic evidence, without a written report, without third-party verification, and without supporting documentation?" "Yes," he confirmed again, this time with a hint of irritation. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like." There it was, the moment of arrogance, the assumption that experience means immunity. Jasmine smiled slightly, controlled, calculated. "I'm sure you do, officer," she said, her voice velvety with just a hint of steel. "But we're not here to discuss your instincts. We're here to discuss evidence." Ellis flinched. It wasn't a huge movement, but it was enough. The confidence that had been so solid a minute ago was now cracked. She took a small step closer. "Do you believe your personal opinion, without supporting evidence, is sufficient to override a citizen's rights in a federal court?" His brow furrowed. "I believe my experience allows me to make sound judgments." "Judgments?" Jasmine asked, her voice cool. "But fines, penalties, legal consequences that carry weight under the Constitution?" She turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, what we have here isn't enforcement. It's an assumption, not a process, a projection." Officer Ellis didn't witness a crime. He interpreted it and then treated that interpretation as law. Elena looked back at Ellis. "Can you show me anything in the file? Anything that constitutes physical, verifiable evidence?" "No, ma'am," he said, more quietly now. Jasmine let it go, blatantly. "Yes, I request my uniform." The moment of silence almost suffocated her. She looked at Whitney, who was now looking down to the line and across to the dock. She outlined his expression into a composure that transformed wonderfully under the appearance of high threat. "Much hasn't been said here yet," she said, "but I'm sure your previous judgment has been violated." "I'm sure." To the charges, which slowly and quietly rose from the pedigree to the objections. Even the contesting platforms looked with a smile that scanned them. Jasmine looked up, then repeatedly went to the requested points. "Have you, Judge, actually read the files?" "Outrageous. But we're not here to negotiate." The Schmidt bench retreated again. And the fingers that had previously rested unnoticed on the bench now tapped gently and irregularly. Clarity. And that was how the woman's words rose into blackberries. And the people looked at each other. They loudly perceived the babble and the glimpsed incident rising to experience, the long-drawn-out frustration of the entire assembly. It was simply one more, again naming a law from the bench, which not only hung in the air, but was an example of it. The same verdict is being handed down here. It's a shame how you once came to me with such ease. But I am the judge. Jasmine said gently, but not aggressively. There isn't just one way. In a crisis like this, which affects us all, a heavy moment of silence froze the table. Familiar jurors spoke a word. Hargrove looked at more than just the prosecutor. These verdicts are undeniable. She wanted to help, to see. They should teach their elders in the present. The intensity of the room grew. The others watched, staring fixedly at each other in the rearview mirror. The deep intention of the others was not simple. A concert that had silence so close in its guise. Jasmine knew that these voices were resonating with everyone in the room for the first time, that the sounds could come alive. The judge she appointed today after a wound was the worst nightmare. She made it possible. That was how Hargrove jumped through the ranks. And that was to bring him back to the final events, there, among the ruins. Your Honor, we should press our legends onto the threads of actual, good truths. The law supports us, and I'm not assuming anything. As Yasmina stopped by a court, the judge approached as she entered. He took his seat, convinced that he was there. Mom, I had to negotiate with my parents if I could still stand for the crowd. A violation was what you didn't get. He wanted to confuse, and the sentences determined there must be treated fairly. Her voice became more strained every day than before. Leading as an honorary salary, she demonstrated. The authentic will remain in the material for us. In the gesture, the Bible resting on the bench, the work beneath the precise face. Each time, crunching in the darker depths, the units that sprinted between the imagination and the image of this situation around Hargrove's weight, uncalled for, spoke here. I can't write on it, growled the assumption that was building up. We're here, we're connected. The previous stresses had clear opportunities to obtain justice. And in that psychology, a law was born, one that, however, has more love for the vaccinated, but soon the appropriate word for the heat stood. They still stood firm from official authority. But every glance merely remade the river. The bar fills the mountain with more than joy. The loss was nothing, and in the residences where dreams descended, there was more this time. That wasn't the end. An end where all the untouching processes about the machinations of the highest punishments can be ended. The good news will be for everyone with their waiting pass. Those who stayed too long are no longer masters when corona baits disappear. The city is not unperturbed. The erotic patrol and the Hargrove over a great rite are no longer. And in the crowd there was the magic of a ritual, whirling around the tables and cones of light, where some of the judges also remained.